Well, hello everyone. How are you? It's really nice to see you and be with you. Also, today, there is a cricket in the house with us. You might have heard it already. It was chirping through the 5 o'clock. So I just want to let you know, I think it's left over from Zach's bad jokes last week, maybe. Hey, he told me to say that. He did. I'm not that funny on my own. I'm not. So anyway, if you hear it, I know it's going to be a little distracting, but just hang with me and maybe he'll go to sleep. That's what I'm hoping for. So we are jumping right back into our look at the book of Romans tonight. And I want to remind us of a few things as we do that. Romans is a letter. And so we need to then consider who it's from and who it's to and what it's about. And so who it's from. Right, well, the Apostle Paul is writing this letter. And we've talked at length about Paul in here. So if you remember, he is an erudite Pharisee turned missionary when he has this incredible encounter with Jesus on one of these crusades to wipe out and kill this entire Jesus movement and its believers, which is pretty intense. Now, who is this letter to? Right, well, Paul is writing to the church in Rome. It's a group of new Jesus followers, and many of them are Jewish. Many of them are Gentiles, which means they're non-Jewish people. And a lot of them might have been in Jerusalem during the time of the resurrection. And now they have returned back home in Rome. And now they're trying to figure out what to do with this news about Jesus and what this means for their life and for their families. And then lastly, what is this letter about? What is Paul's intention in writing it? And it's kind of curious because it doesn't really read like a letter at all. It reads more like a theology textbook, right? And Paul, he hasn't been to Rome yet. And so essentially he's writing to a group of strangers, right? But when we consider that this letter was likely the first piece of Christian literature, the first piece of Christian text that the Romans had ever seen like this, right? Because these stories about Jesus and his teaching and his words and his life and his death and his resurrection, those weren't being circulated on paper yet. And so in that light, it makes a little bit more sense that Paul would then choose this opportunity, right, to really spell out and explain what it is we believe as followers of Jesus. And so this letter, it is our theology. It is what we believe and how what we believe gets lived out in the world. And so far, we've covered chapters 1 through 3. And in them, Paul has made some pretty scandalous claims, right? He began with the gospel. It's this breaking news announcement about Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the Messiah sent to redeem God's dream for all of creation. That's pretty big news, and it's news that God's people have been waiting centuries on. And then Paul moves on to this very bold claim about righteousness, which we talked about a few weeks ago, that repairing our relationship with God, right, being made right in his eyes, it has everything to do with faith. Faith in this Jesus he just told us about. And then Paul doesn't pull any punches when he says that all have fallen short of God's standards. And so we could never use the law and our ability to keep it as a way back into this relationship with God. And so we all, the religious and the non-religious, right, Jew and Gentile, we all drift towards sin. Therefore, we all need Jesus. And that very likely kind of burst his Jewish audience's kind of ethnocentric religious rule-keeping bubble. Right now, Paul, we're going to move into chapters 4 and 5 here. And his tactic now is to support these claims that he's just made. They're a little offensive, right, with some examples. And because Paul is smart, he's going to pick 2 of the Jewish people's heroes. So he uses the story of Abraham, who is known as the father of the Jewish faith, and he uses David, the greatest king of Israel. And it's literary genius, which makes me kind of love Paul even more that he does this, because he knows that these were stories that the people he was writing to would have known very well. And they were both figures that would have been well respected and revered, right, by the Jewish tradition. And so he's using something familiar, right? Very something familiar to demonstrate something a little bit more foreign to them. And he's using two people who he knows they already admire and respect to make this irrefutable case about faith. Now, if we're not as familiar with their stories, we might not feel as emotionally connected or captivated by all this talk of Abraham in chapter 4 right away. And so there's some catching up, right, that we have to do on our end. And I'm going to do my best to work it in as we go. But for Paul's original audience, they would have immediately been able to identify with this history that Paul is kind of calling on to illustrate his point. So what about Abraham is Paul drawing our attention to here? Well, I want to focus on verse 3. So this is Romans 4, verse 3. It says, "For the scriptures tell us that Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith." Now, Paul is saying a lot here with very little, and his word choice is crucial. And so I want to spend the rest of our time together unpacking two very important words that he uses here in this verse. The first is he uses the word counted, right? He says, God counted him as righteous. And so the very specific Greek word that he is using is logizomai. Logizomai. Now, I just watched In the Heights, which is fantastic, so you should definitely see it if you haven't. But there's a bit that the main character does where he says, say it out loud so that it doesn't disappear. And I want us to try that. Okay, so we're going to say this word out loud together so it doesn't disappear. So try saying logizomai. Ready? Logizomai. Great job. You speak Greek, right? So logizomai, it literally translates credited. So it's an accounting term. Right? And to credit something means to give something new status that wasn't there before. And so right away, this word caught my attention, right? Because there is this reality about credit, right? Like the banking kind, about debt, about an unpaid balance that we understand. Even if we can't grasp all of what Jesus is up to, we know about this. Right? This is something we can identify just in our own lived-in experience in the world, right? This is something we know that Paul is tapping into here. So the other night, our team was out to dinner, and somehow this infamous story about how Tommy almost drowned while whitewater rafting came up. And I remember, this was years ago at this point, but I remember this being a thing, that it was kind of intense and a little dramatic, but I had never actually heard the story for myself. And so I go, this is my shot to hear the story from Tommy's mouth. And so I go, will you tell the story about, the time at the river? And so he tells me that someone who shall not be named, because this will live on the internet forever, because that's how it works, kids in cyberspace, they rode the wrong direction when they hit some white water and the raft flipped, right? So everybody winds up outside of the boat in the water, and Tommy, as he's trying to kind of figure out which way is up and get his bearings, realizes he's stuck under the raft, right? And every time he tries to come up or surface, he realizes the raft is moving with me and I can't break through. And he tells me that this is the moment when he had the thought, I might die. This might be how I go, that this might be the moment that I don't make it, right? That I don't survive, because he was stuck, right? And he was helpless. And so there's more tumbling and more water, and eventually, finally, the guide is able to reach in and pull him out by his life vest, set him back on the raft, right? And Tommy survives, right? Lucky for us. This is a wild story, right? And I asked him if I could tell it, and he said yes, so he knows that you might have more questions for him later if you want to know more about that. But I've had these chapters, right? Chapters 4 and 5 kind of rolling around in the back of my head. And as he was telling this story the other night, I went, that's it. That's it. That's the feeling, right? This helplessness. And if you've ever nearly drowned, well, then you know it. You know the panic, and you know the fear, right? And you know the feeling of there's no way I'm getting out of this by myself. And I think what Paul is tapping into here is that debt feels a lot like drowning, right? Like being underwater without a way to the surface, without a way to breathe, and that panic, right? That fear, that knowing there's no way out of this by myself is the same. And so Paul is drawing on this felt helplessness to get us to understand the scope, like the magnitude, the weight of what Jesus really accomplished for us on the cross. Right? See, the reality is that sin has left us with a debt. It has left us with a debt to pay. And if we're being honest and not ignoring it or neglecting it, we are helpless to pay that debt off on our own. And so I think it's helpful to kind of put ourselves in this place when thinking about this. And so pick a number, right? Pick a number that scares you. I don't know what that is, and you do. Right? Maybe it is the actual number of credit card debt you are carrying around right now. Or maybe it is that student loan that you are taking with you to the grave. You will be paying that thing off until you die. Right? Or maybe it's the amount you have to raise, right, to put your kids through school, or it's the amount that it's going to take for you to keep your apartment or keep the lights on. Right? You know that number. And so thinking of that, staring down that kind of balance, it brings us to this place where we can acknowledge no amount of work, no side hustle, no amount of passive income could chip away at that thing fast enough. And so if you're there now, or if you have been there, right, you know it. You know it's paralyzing. You know it's bondage. You know it's like not being able to breathe and there is no way to the surface. Right? And in this metaphor, right, that we're working with, Jesus on the cross is like Jesus showing up at your door with a checkbook, right? And saying, what's the number? What is the amount? I will pay it. I will cover the whole thing, right? I will credit your account, the amount that you cannot come up with. And in the future, when you continue, right, to rack on more debt, it will count for that too. You won't have to pay this off. I will cover it now, and I will cover it forever. The only catch is that he asks, do you trust me? Do you trust me, and will you know me? Will you get to know me? And we have to be careful, right, with metaphors, because they're not always a perfect parallel, and sometimes they can spin out of control into something that's not true. So this is not like you got a lucky scratch-off ticket and you won the lottery, right? This is not luck, and this is not the kindness of an anonymous donor with just really deep pockets who you're the beneficiary of. And this is not Bernie with his mittens, right? Just like dissolving student debt. That's not what's going on here, right? This is Jesus. He has a name, and he willingly pays the very specific amount of debt that we owe because of our sin. And he paid it with his life. Right? A debt that our obedience, our ability to keep enough of the right rules enough of the time was never going to be able to cover. And so Jesus' death, and here's that word, it counts for us. It counts for us. His sacrifice, his death, his payment of sin on the cross, it gets credited to us. And we are then given this new status with God. So logizomai means that faith counted as righteousness. It means that God treats us as though we are righteous even when we don't live that way, especially when we don't live that way. So being counted, being credited righteous means that God's treatment of us, the way he sees us, it's not a reflection now of our own behavior. It means that I don't have to fear condemnation and punishment or judgment when I choose the way of sin instead of choosing the way of Jesus, because his perfection is now credited to me. That is what sits in my bank account, not my debt, not my sin, but Jesus' perfection. And even when I mess it up and when I don't get it right, God is still treating me as if I am, right? Because I have been credited Jesus' very own righteousness. And then this is the paradox for every Jesus follower. It's to be made right and yet to choose what is wrong all at the same time, right? And that's confusing, and it creates this tension, and Paul is going to go on to write a lot about that, but that's for the coming weeks. And so now I want to look at the other important word from verse 3. Right? We've talked about how God counted Abraham as righteous. But now I want to talk about that word faith, right? Because of his faith. These words like faith or belief or trust, they tend to overlap and they kind of weave in and out of our conversations somewhat carelessly, or we just use them interchangeably. But the kind of faith that Paul is talking about here, it's not interchangeable and it's not careless, but he's talking about something very, very specific. He's talking about the kind of faith that saves us, the kind of faith that gets counted, right, as righteousness. So if we look again very closely at verse 3, we'll notice that it says Abraham believed God. Abraham believed God. It doesn't read Abraham believed in God. Right? And this is because Paul is actually quoting a verse from a conversation between Abraham and God way back in the book of Genesis. Okay, way back when Abraham was still being called Abram. So don't get confused, it's the same person. Right? But God had made a promise to Abraham. He said, I want you to leave what you know. I want you to take everything, and I'm going to give you a land of your own. Right? He's saying, I have a place set apart for you, and I'm going to make you into an entire nation. Right? Your descendants, your family, they're going to bless the whole earth. Right? Every family will be blessed because of your family, Abraham. Right? But some time goes on, and this still hasn't happened. And so Abraham begins to doubt, is this real? Is this possible? Is this ever going to happen for me? And then here is a bit of their conversation from Genesis. This is Abram talking. He says, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, and so one of my servants will then be my heir." And the Lord said to him, No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. And then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. Count the stars if you can. That is how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. All right, so Paul is reminding us here that there is a significant distinction between believing God and believing in God, or believing there is a God. All right, so to believe God the way that Abraham believed God implies a level of trust. It implies a level of trust. Right? Because clearly Abraham could acknowledge the existence of a God. Right? They are having a conversation. So he's like, there is a God over here, we're talking, but I don't know if I trust him. That doesn't mean Abraham trusts him. And Abraham could also recognize that God is all powerful, or that he's loving, or that he is creator, but that also doesn't necessarily mean that he trusts him. So in saying Abraham believed God, is to say that he trusted God to keep his promise. He trusted God to keep his word, right? And this trust, that kind of belief, that kind of faith, that is what gets counted or credited as righteousness. Right? Paul goes on to write a bit more about it in Romans chapter 4. He says, he's talking about Abraham, he was fully convinced that God is able to do whatever he promises. And because of Abraham's faith, because Abraham trusted God to keep his word, God counted him as righteous. And when this happened, when God counted him as righteous, it wasn't just for Abraham's benefit, it was recorded for our benefit too, assuring us that God will also count us as righteous if we believe him, if we believe in him, the one who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was handed over to die because of our sins, and he was raised to life to make us right with God. And so Paul, he's explaining here that Abraham isn't the exception, but that you and I, we are like those stars in the sky, right? That Abraham couldn't possibly have tallied, right? He is not the exception, but this being counted as righteous, being treated as forgiven and saved and free, even when we choose things other than God, that is still available to us. It wasn't just for Abraham centuries ago. It is for you and for me now. It is for today. If we would just have faith, but have saving faith. Right? See, the question that God was really posing to Abraham, and the question that he would pose to you and I today is, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Meaning, do you trust me to save you? Do you trust me to keep my promise to you? Do you trust that my son, Jesus' sacrifice, that is what saves you and covers you and frees you and forgives you, not your ability to keep enough of my rules? You don't save you. I do. Do you trust me? See, saving faith means that we have to stop trusting ourselves. We have to give up faith in our own ability to live righteously, to live every law perfectly. We have to stop counting on our own strength and how many of these rules we can get right, and if we just stop doing enough of the wrong ones. And maybe you have been a Christian for years. Maybe you have been a Christian for a long time, and when you hear something like this, you're tempted to go, oh, I know this one. I know this one, right? I know that faith in Jesus is what saves me, and you know it. But here's what I've experienced, is that it doesn't matter how long we've been following Jesus. This is a message we have to return to over and over because our trust drifts over time, right? We tend to drift back into thinking that we can trust ourselves, right, to sustain our acceptance and our peace with God. And we call it maturity because our life looks pretty Christ-like, right? But we're hoping that it's sustaining us, right? We're hoping that if we just keep doing enough of the right things, well, then God won't change his mind about us. Right? It's sneaky and it's subtle. And we say we believe all the right things. We say we believe God is loving and we believe he's powerful. And yes, he sent his son, Jesus, to save us. But our proving and our performing and our behavior would say otherwise. It would say that we actually have more faith in ourselves than we have in God. Right? And it shows up slowly and subtly, and we start trusting in our performance and how well we parent and how well we show up in our job. Right? It shows up in how well we can be a moral or upright person. It shows up even in our service and in our volunteerism. We use these things as a way to say, please, God, don't change your mind about me. Right? We make it up to us. And the Christian life is being asked by God over and over and over again, do you trust me? And the first time, it's do you trust me to save you? Because you can't learn to swim when you're drowning. You can't learn to swim when you're underwater and when you can't breathe. And so we just need to get above water, right, before we can start building something new. And then you might think, well, Lindsay, what if I'm the reason I'm drowning? Like it wasn't an accident. I didn't get thrown overboard. But my own choices, my own rebellion, my own arrogance, that is what sunk my life. Does Jesus still want to pull me out of the water now? And yes. Yes, Paul goes on to write in chapter 5. He says, when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners, while we were still underwater, while we were still suffocating under that crippling debt. And since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. See, Jesus isn't waiting on you to just show some effort or to try and save yourself enough times and then he'll step in. So we can quit trying to save ourselves when we're underwater and when we can't breathe. Jesus' first question to us is not going to be, well, what did you do to get yourself here? Or what are we going to do differently next time? His question to us is always, do you trust me? Do you trust me? I am enough to save you from this. I have done everything possible. I have done everything it was going to require to pull you out of this water forever. And so stop trying to save yourself, and would you just trust me? And when you say yes to that rescue, right, to that trusting, now you're in relationship with Jesus. And now you're credited righteousness. And now you have a new status with God. And Paul goes on to say it like this. He says, "For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his son while we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his son. And so now we can rejoice. We can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends of God." And here's the beautiful thing about being friends of God and understanding this whole counted as righteousness and saving faith and all of these really convoluted words that Paul uses. It's beautiful because as you spend more time above water, now that you can breathe, and when Jesus asks you, well, how did we get here? Or what are we going to do differently next time? Right? We are now in the safety of this relationship. We have this forgiven, free status, which means we can be honest. We can be honest because now he's not counting our mistakes or our past against us. Right? He doesn't look at our metaphorical bank account and go, wow, look at that amount of debt. Look at all of this that you have accrued over your lifetime. He is not counting any of it against us. And so when he goes to ask me again, right, Lindsay, do you trust me? You trusted me to save you. And so will you trust me with your relationship? Will you trust me with your family? Will you trust me with your money? Will you trust me with this next season of your life? I don't have to be afraid of saying yes and then messing it up and then God being disappointed in me. Because when I am counted, when I am credited righteous, there's no such thing as God looking at me disappointed. I am covered, right, by that perfection of Jesus. And so I also don't use this friendship, right, as this pass or an invisibility cloak to all of the ways that I keep bankrupting or sinking my life, right? Because while sin doesn't change my status with God, it might absolutely change my status with others. And I really don't want to go back to that underwater kind of living. I don't want to go back to that panic and that fear and that chaos. And so saving faith, it spares me separation, disconnection, judgment from God, but it might not spare me, right, the darkness and the death that sin can lead to here on earth. But this friendship, right, it affords me the safety to be honest about the ways that I drift. I can be real with God about the ways I mess up because he's not counting it against me. It means we don't have to wallow or stay stuck in our defeat because God is not looking at you that way. It affords us this freedom and this chance, right, to kind of crawl or sometimes stumble back towards Jesus over and over with these different parts and seasons of my life as he asks me time and time again, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Paul writes in that last verse I shared that we rejoice. We can rejoice in this new status, in this place of safety and of freedom and of credited righteousness. And so we're going to do just that. We're going to sing this one last song together. And if you have said, yes, Jesus, I trust you, well, then I encourage you to sing with confidence and with joy and with hope because we have been made friends of God. So Kindred, would you stand? Would you rejoice with us?